World Bank forecast that Nigeria's economy's projection is expected to grow by 2.8% in 2023, down from 3.3% recorded in 2022, and further recover to 3% in 2024 and 2025. The World Financial Institution, in its African Pulse report in April 2023's edition, released last week, said Nigeria's economic growth translates into growth per capita of 0.2% in 2023 and 0.4% in 2024 and 2025, which is insufficient to reduce extreme poverty in the country. On the global economic stage, the World Bank made a slight increase to its growth outlook for 2023, forecasting a 2% growth for 2023, up from 1.7% forecast in the month of January. To help us understand this better, what the 2% increase, what does this mean from 1.7% to 2%? What have they seen that we need to understand? The Director of Research and Strategy with Chapel Hill Denham, Mr. Tajuddin Ibrahim, joins me via Zoom to discuss this more. Mr. Ibrahim, thank you so much. It's good to see you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yes, looking at this report, we've had projections and reprojections. We must agree to that fact because of all of the challenges that have been happening globally. But now the World Bank is saying from 1.7%, we could be doing about 2%. That's for global growth, saying that growth will be driven by services, trade, construction, manufacturing, and others. What is your understanding of this report?
I think the major thing to bear in mind is that, before now, global environment was experiencing high interest rate environment, largely because of high inflation. So many central banks across the world were raising interest rates to curb inflation. And what we have seen since February is that, inflation seems to be on a sustained downward trend, across major central banks, particularly when we look at, advanced economies. So we have experienced, a sizable moderation in inflation in those environments. And what that implies is that we most likely are going to see a slowdown in the rate at which monetary policy authorities in those areas and regions across the world, a slowdown in the rate at which they raise interest rates. When there is a slowdown or there is unexpected slowdown, what that implies is we probably are going to see an improvement in incentive by consumers and small and large businesses, generally speaking, to borrow money for expansion purposes, to borrow money also for consumption. So when we view it from a credit increase standpoint on the back of slower rate of increasing interest rates, then one would recognize that the global growth most likely is going to witness some level of recovery. And that is what, largely speaking, is responsible for the revision to 2% from 1.7%, because other factors to bear in mind include, tension in certain areas in Europe. That tension, for instance, has not slowed down. But one key element that we notice is that, we are seeing a slowdown in the rate at which central banks are, increasing their interest rate. And I think that sends a positive signal in terms of availability of credit, in terms of demand for credit by consumers, by small and large businesses to expand, their business. That in itself suffices for, an upward revision. Nevertheless, I think one has to caution that, the 2% is still below the 3.1% global growth that World Bank announced for 2022. So we are still in a lower growth environment, generally speaking, in my view.
While I understand that, but there's this recommendation to continue to tighten monetary policy to rein in inflation. It seems not to be working everywhere. Like you would explain that there's a supply side inflation and there's also the demand side inflation. Economists understand all of this better. But I am worried that this seems not to be helping in any way to reduce the figures that we see. And most of these countries also have issues with their currency. There is this weakness of almost all currencies.
So if we, in our research, what we do is to divide the global environment into three broad categories. We have the advanced economies. In that case, we are looking at the US, the UK, Japan, and also the Eurozone. And we have the second layer that we call the emerging market economies. And we have the final layer that we call the African economies. So if we look at the first layer, what is happening, largely speaking, in that first layer that we call the advanced economies is that we are seeing monetary policy rates being hiked in those environments. And because their own inflation is largely demand pulled, so the inflation rate is responding accordingly to the increases in interest rates. Let me give you an example. The average inflation in that environment has moderated by 125 basis points since the beginning of this year. I'm talking about the combination of the US, UK, Japan, and also the Eurozone. So it is working for them in that environment. And I will also argue that hiking interest rates to curb inflation is working to a considerable extent for the emerging market economies, because even for them as well, year to date, we have seen moderation in their inflation rate to on average by about 232 basis points. In that basket, at Chapel Hill Denham, we have 12 countries that we track, and China is one of the countries. So it is working for them in that regard, because demand is largely speaking responsible for their own higher inflation. Africa is where the story has been different because what is driving our inflation in Africa is not necessarily because we are demanding more. It is because we are incurring more cost in terms of production. We are incurring more cost in terms of rendering services. So those are the elements that are sort of driving our inflation. And no matter how much we increase interest rates in Africa, generally speaking, and in Nigeria in particular, we may not see inflation come down significantly because we are hiking interest rates. And that is because inflation in itself, in our own case, is not being driven by demand. It is more of cost effect. So those are the directions I believe we should be looking at when we want to understand how those elements are impacting global economies and also Nigeria in particular.
Back home, Nigeria, now we've also seen, well, a bit of review regards to these figures, but everyone is bothered, of course, about the level of debt, issues around crude oil production, talking about crude theft, because that's one resource that we actually generate a lot of funds from at the moment, even as we try to diversify our economy. What do you make of this? We not being able to meet OPEC quota, how all of this will affect revenue generation moving on in 2023. In few weeks, a new government will take over. Everyone is bothered about the revenue challenge. What is your take on that and how it affects our growth?
I think the concern around revenue generation is valid. We are currently facing challenges around being able to generate as much revenue as required on the crude oil front. We recognize that we rely heavily on crude oil not only for revenue generation for the government, but also in terms of what we export to other countries to earn foreign currencies from those regions. So we should, in my view, the incoming administration should consider, tightening whatever is, sort of appears loose on those ends. And we know them. The first is around, destruction, attack on oil installations. And the second we know is around theft of, crude oil. So when we are able to tackle those two key, sort of negative developments or challenges, then
All right, there. I'm sure we'll connect back to Mr. Tajuddin Ibrahim to continue this conversation. Mr. Ibrahim, you're there?
yes, I'm here.
Great. We didn't get the last part of your submission. It's a little bit of audio issues, I think network issues, I beg your pardon. So maybe you could just wrap up that part of the conversation.
Plans, the strategies, and execute them to ensure that we are able to rely less on crude oil. And to also add to it, whatever we are producing on the non-oil side, we should add value before we're considering export, instead of exporting them as raw materials, because eventually advanced economies will buy those raw materials from us, transform them into finished goods, and sell them back to us at much higher prices because they've added value to them. So let us also consider adding value to such commodities before we're considering, exporting them in large quantities. That, I believe, will be more value accretive for us in Nigeria than to just export in raw form, in my view.
Great stuff. The World Bank is also quick to talk about electricity supply challenge that we face in this part of the world and advising government to introduce mini grids, because everyone believes that the present national grid cannot serve more than 200 million people of this country, and they're talking about mini grids for maybe rural areas to be able to at least boost little businesses across all of those places. Do you also see that as the way to go? Can we work around that in this part of the world?
I completely agree that it is doable, and it will go a long way to add value to those areas that we regard as rural areas. The urban cities, we all know, are full in terms of population, and if nothing is done in those rural areas to ensure that we have the right level of electrification in those areas, we will continue to see significant increases in urban city population, and that in itself, is going to have at some point, a bad impact on the cities if there is no proper planning for them. To avoid such a situation, we of course can consider mini grids in those rural areas. What it will do is that it will pop up those areas in terms of economic activities. It will also, to some extent, attract investments from the cities to the rural areas, and over time, if the plan is well executed, we could see increased investment into Nigeria, and rural areas will be one of such key destinations, largely because of good electrification network. I think it is a good idea if we can implement it, in my view.
The agricultural and industrial sectors are very strategic for an economy like Nigeria. But you agree with me that at the moment they grapple with the big elephant in the cupboard. Issues around cost of energy, raw materials. How will all of this impact us? Because we talk about inclusive growth. How do we achieve that with all of these challenges?
Okay, so I think there are some elements that we have to consider in this case. In terms of energy costs, we can consider a lot of, cheaper sources of energy, and energy sources that are also sustainable, and also sources that are a lot friendly in terms of carbon emission. And this is where issues around solar powered energy sources are very important. If we can adopt that. Gas is also a very interesting source for us in that regard, because we flare most of the gas that we produce in this country. We should look in that direction as well. There are also some energy source that could be generated via waste, and also via byproduct in the agriculture space. All that we need is just to invest in such systems that will ensure that as you are farming, you are also making production for byproducts that you can use to source energy in your farms, and also in those rural areas. There are a lot of ideas, but it is just that not many of them are pursued when they are projected to the authorities. So I think the incoming government will explore all of those elements and all of those options to ensure that we move forward, at least from the current level that we are. We may not be able to achieve all those plans and targets in 4 years, but my sense is that considerable level of them could be achieved if we really are serious if we are serious at achieving them, in my sense.
Indeed, you took that away from me, because I wanted us to wrap up on that note. That are there any low-hanging fruits at all? It looks like most of the projections are like midterm to long-term and all of that. But many would say, are there any quick wins for the incoming administration?
So the quick win that I see may be a bit, challenging for many people in Nigeria, but the reality is that, we just have to do it. One low-hanging fruit, in my view, is, fuel subsidy removal, and I know that, there are plans around, subsidy, giving people some money to sort of reduce the impact it will have on their pockets. And I also argue that, we are enjoying subsidy in Lagos and Abuja, but most people in Lagos and Abuja can afford to buy fuel at much higher prices compared to those states that you mentioned earlier, Delta states, where they are buying at an average of around 300 and above. So when we take away subsidy, it will be like, an immediate impact, in my view. The second thing that I think we can do immediately is to unify our foreign currency exchange rate. It is very important. It is one low-hanging fruit that the government can also achieve the moment they start, next month, to begin to run the country. I think those two are key elements in my sense.
I must thank you so much, Mr. Tajuddin Ibrahim. He is the Director, Research and Strategy with Chapel Hill Denham. Thank you so much for your insights into this topic of discourse.